As with everything in life, one wants to see growth, expansion, and evolution, including the number of listens of this podcast. We'd like to see growth and expansion. So tell your friends. If you enjoy this, spread it by word of mouth, send links, tweet about it, and it'll keep happening. We'll keep doing them.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Front Lounge with KONGOS. This is episode 13. It's the four of us, and we're going to talk about breaking news now. We announced an album called 1929 and a TV show, an episodic docu-series called Bus Call. Neither of them are out yet, but they will be in the future.
Yeah, I mean, these ideas and these sort of creations are months and years in the making for us, and we've been waiting a long time to announce them, and so we're happy to be able to do a tweet or do an Instagram post and let our fans and followers in on what we're up to. And slowly, it's going to be a very slow rollout. We want you to get excited, but we don't want you to expect that tomorrow it's all going to fall in your lap. We're going to be pacing ourselves here.
Yeah, if you really think about it, it's 14 billion years in the making.
This has been our first actual breaking news on this podcast, because usually it's just like complete
nonsense,
bullshit that we're doing that. And if you hear clicking in the background of this podcast, it's because we have one of our video editors right now working on one of the episodes, typing up notes on each of the clips. So that's what that clicking sound is. Yeah.
The Bus Call thing's pretty exciting because we've been capturing footage since we started touring, years ago. But really, we had a full-time videographer since 2014 on almost every single tour. And so a lot of things have happened, and a lot of them have been captured. And it's funny to see how this series that we're making, you kind of want it to be scripted. You want to tell a story. You want there to be an arc to it. And it's very hard to manufacture that because stuff just fucking happened. And now we're trying to piece it all together and make the story. So how that all unfolds and then watching it later is pretty kind of interesting for us, since we've forgotten a lot of what happened. 3 years ago, I don't remember much what happened.
Yeah, we were watching through dailies, as we're calling them, basically cut down versions of each day yesterday. And it's funny because half the time you weren't actually in them because the cameraman was off with like Dylan and Jesse, or Danny and Jesse, and not me and Dylan, or any grouping. So you didn't actually see any of that day happen. So it's been weird getting to see a day I was in time occur from a different angle and watch that all play out.
I think it's also interesting having now mapped it out using the new, like the mind map program, or the post-it notes that we put up on the wall, like a crazy crime-solving mystery. The fact that the 4 years basically condensed now into these 10, 20 to 30-minute episodes, it really is a story that someone could have written. When you start looking back on it, it has its arcs and its downs and ups. And
yeah, I mean, it's not Homer's Odyssey, but
it's first part, second part, and third part.
We've been using this mind map software, an online one called Coggle.it, and it is funny because it looks like the musings of a madman seeing one of our tour days mapped out.
It looks like an episode of Homeland, where you walk into Carrie's apartment and there's red string, connecting all kinds of unrelated things.
It's been another funny thing I think for all of us to think about is with Jesse's baby now, Eve. When she grows up, she's going to be able to watch the docu-series about her dad that her dad and his brothers made. And not only that, we have close to 100 terabytes of raw footage. She's never going to watch it. She's not going to want to. But if she wanted to know about Jesse, she'd have hours and hours of ability to psychoanalyze him.
The years leading up to her existence. That's why it's going to be edited, and she'll see the edited version, which will be slightly less embarrassing than the unedited version.
Well, that's what happens in storytelling anyway. When Dad tells us his stories of the good old 60s and 70s rock star days, I'm sure they're edited.
Yeah, you cut out all the boring days.
And then I sat in my living room for the 12th day in a row and tried to write a song.
Well, that is something that we're actually trying to do in the pacing of this series. Is when we started working on this, we had all kinds of ideas about what the show was going to be. You know, we're thinking kind of travel series, and then we started realizing we're never going to do it better than Anthony Bourdain or any of these great, people that have been doing travel shows. So what we decided we were going to focus on was showing what our experience was like on the road in a relatively unfiltered way, because we've just become so bored with watching these album release documentaries or making the album things where it's literally just a bunch of artists patting themselves on the back. Yeah, and I'm not like we're going to pat ourselves on the back and do all of that, but we really wanted to show a fairly realistic portrayal of life on the road for a small, medium-sized band like us.
And also just any TV show that we watch, ultimately the story is important, but it kind of becomes secondary to the character and the sort of this little family or this group of people that you become invested in, good or bad, in a TV show. Mm-hmm. And so we started to see that really between us four as brothers and then the kind of extended family of the crew, these guys we've been traveling with for years, a lot of them spending 24 hours a day in the same space, working together, partying together. That becomes the sort of extended family, and that's the quote list of characters. So I think we don't want to talk too much about it before it's actually out, but we'll be teasing it now and letting you in on the sort of release plan of all this as it comes together. And Bus Call, Life on Tour, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and a lot of people have been asking about the music or making comments on the fact that we mentioned so many songs. We have a lot of songs, and each episode is going to feature new songs, and the bed music and the score is also going to be done by us. So that's all still kind of a process. We're trying to figure out exactly how we use that music, how it's released and all that. So if our announcements are a little bit nebulous, that's basically why.
It's also been fun just from the recording side, I think, for all of us, seeing this as a vehicle for different kinds of songs, because I think we got hung up and people do tend to get hung up in thinking about songs for radio or for synchronizations and that sort of thing. And now we can have a song that's a little off the wall or left field and say, well, it works perfectly for a scene that we're trying to cut together or a particular vibe we're trying to create. So it's freed us up in our recording and our writing a bit, where we're not necessarily always thinking about commerciality in the simplest sense of the word.
Or just if you think of a song for an album, you usually think of it being a complete thing, like a circular idea kind of, whereas for video or for when you're putting it to as a soundtrack, it's open-ended. I find you don't need to finish it in the same way. It can just be an open-ended kind of vibe or emotion that you're working on.
Yeah, if you know our music that's been out, so far, and you heard Traveling On from Lunatic, and that was your only impression or your first impression of us, you would have an entirely different picture of us as a band versus Come With Me Now. And I think just purely relatively, the singles or the hits or whatever, those are the ones that get heard by most people. But there's quite a breadth to our style of music. We can have an acoustic ballad, and then we can have a sort of banger like I'm Only Joking or Come With Me Now. And they all serve a purpose. In our live show, they serve a purpose in our sort of creative outlet, and they will also serve a purpose in this TV show, because there's everything from drama to emotional scenes to comedy to straight up energy and bus parties. So we just know none of our. We're gonna have to figure out how we do that, because at our bus parties we play exclusively
Katy Perry and Rihanna, and that's extremely expensive to license. So we might have to just overdub some of our own Dutch electro music or something.
Maybe we can talk to Epic, our label, because they'll cut us a break on some of their other artists, and we can play the latest track that features some sort of rear end, bouncing on the video as the music video.
So the other big news, obviously, of the Bus Calls, we announced an album. For us, they're kind of tied together because a lot of the songs are featuring on the show and vice versa. But like Dylan was saying,
is it vice versa?
Vice versa. Vice.
Vice versa always reminds me of that movie Magicians. with Tig
Schwiller.
Alan Arkin, right?
Alan Arkin and and Tig
You
Schwiller.
couldn't. Yeah, this is total aside, but you can't find that movie anywhere.
The only place I've been able to find it is like on eBay, some used DVD, and someone's charging $60 for it or something.
He's
like
saying
that.
they're magicians, and he's saying he's propositioning a guy to be his partner as a magician. So he says we could be Max and Hugo, or Hugo and Max, or vice versa.
Yeah, it's a hidden gem, that movie. So if you can find it anywhere, tell us where you found it and then watch it. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah, the album.
Oh yeah.
I mean, we won't talk about the album too much, but it's just to say that it's been really, I don't know about you guys, but this has been one of the most fun to work on musically, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
I think there's been a few elements that have made it different from any album we've done so far, and most importantly, I think the space that we're recording in. You know, we're renting this place in LA that's really got a nice sound to it. You know, we had Mick and some of the other guys from our crew come out and work on the treatment of the room to get it sounding in a certain way. It's big, high ceilings, and they put up these baffles, and so it's comparative to our Phoenix studio, which was intentionally dead. There's carpet on the walls. It's just there's no reverberation in the room intentionally to control the sound, and that produces a certain kind of sound. Whereas now we're working with a space that has a sound, and it leads you in an entirely different direction. The drums sound different, the amps sound different, vocals sound different. So that's been kind of exciting. And then Danny's sort of obsession and foray into analog synths have been a little bit exciting for all of us because, you know, having worked on computers as far as we can remember, and the whole sort of advent of soft synths and everything coming generated from the computer, you know, gets you in a certain mindset, and then all of a sudden you hear these electronics, these raw electronics that make sound, and it's kind of it's very exciting, and we're trying to use them in a different way, in an organic way, and blend them with organic instruments.
I think the thing you're saying about the high ceilings in the room, particularly where we've been recording drums, is we were in a bit of a habit, and I think a lot of bands do this, where you record drums pretty dry and dead, and then you put them in a room virtually, you know, using one of those reverb plugins that we've talked about in the past. And now they're in an actual room that has a natural sound to it, and it's just amazing how much better a real room sounds than even the most expensive emulation of a room.
Yeah.
Also, we have multiple rooms, the big room, and then the guitar amp room and the bathroom and all those things that we've moved the drums around into different rooms to get different sounds, and all actually done vocals in different rooms and had guitar amps in different rooms, whereas the last few albums were really everything was recorded in that one room. So any alterations in the sound had to come post, as opposed to getting them organically.
Yeah, I mean, we all have turned off digital reverbs as well, I think.
Yeah.
Now that you can record a room, even whatever you're recording, if it's drums or guitars or vocal, you can put the bathroom mic on and just pick up that room.
We should tell people a little bit about that. Mick, our front of house engineer, who's been helping out with that, said when we first came in, rented this place, he's like, we're going to use this bathroom for something. Eventually, he walked into it. He knew it sounded good. So eventually, he set up a microphone that it's next to the room where we have all the guitar amps. So whenever
Right
we
above
record,
the toilet.
Yeah. So whenever we record the guitars now, we record this microphone that's set up in the bathroom. We call it the lavy mic, as in the lavatory mic. And it's a really cool sound of just this.
He ran downstairs one day and he put the mic, patched the mic in. Came back up and he said, pull up channel 17. And he said, I knew that fucking toilet would sound good.
Yeah. Well, if you want that shitty guitar sound, we got it covered. The other thing is, and this may be getting into too much detail for most of our listeners, but in the bathroom is a closet that's under the stairwell. And that's where we ended up putting the bass amp, because it reverberates in such a cool way and emphasizes the right aspects of the low end. So the bass amp's in there and you know, some microphones in there to capture it. And we're just getting fucking killer bass sounds on this album.
And it's all been that little practice Fender, the Fender Rumble practice amp that we use for kind of acoustic shows. We had all these ideas that we were going to try different bass amps and different bass heads and cabinets and stuff, and now we just set up this little practice amp in that room, and it's got the perfect sound, and we kind of haven't deviated from it.
This kind of reminds me, doing all this kind of guerrilla style of recording and making whatever you have work. Reminds me of Dad telling us that, when he was one of the first people in England at the time to build a home studio that produced hit records. And he had several, sound engineers come into his basement area at his house in London and tell him he was crazy and there's no way you can build a studio
the
in this
Helios
space.
guy said that specifically. He was kind of an engineering genius. He's built some famous EQs and stuff like that. And he said, yeah, this will never work.
Yeah, and it didn't stop him, obviously, from doing that. And they ended up producing several top 10 records out of that studio. I mean, our dad's. Yeah. But then also Dexy's Midnight Runners did some work there, and a bunch of other people that worked with in that studio.
Def Leppard and Mel Brooks did one of his songs for the History of the World, I think he did there.
Yeah.
Didn't Cat Stevens also recording there, I think? Once
Gary Newman.
Yeah, the story you had about putting the tambourine on the big speaker, the speaker that they said that they were gonna, they didn't care if they blew it up, and so they put a tambourine in the studio on top of the speaker and just blasted a kick drum sound basically through the speaker and blew the speaker, and it bounced the tambourine up and down on top of the speaker, and they recorded that.
It was like the humanized fader on MIDI quantize.
If you check it out, our dad actually has the Guinness Book of World Record for being the first to use a sample on a commercial record for He's Gonna Step on You Again, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think they've wrongly... it's very cool, but I think they've wrongly attributed that.
I think they distinguish between
on a hit record.
a commercial record and it being used because, the idea of a sample's been used for... since recording started, obviously. Yeah. But the fact that it was used on a commercial album or record.
So basically, our dad invented, sampling. So, I mean...
You
no
can
big
blame
deal.
him. Yeah.
He gets paid royalties from Jay-Z and Dr. Dre and everyone now on everything that they ever do.
People at the BBC were messing around with tape loops in the 60s. Not commercially, but they would get like 6 tape machines and make these really long loops around the room. So they would need massive rooms to run these huge loops because there would be, 100 yards of tape going around that they'd tape together to make these long loops.
Somebody might actually believe that saying about Jay-Z.
I was kidding about the hip-hop royalties that my dad gets.
So I think it could be a good transition to music only. We didn't have anything written down for this week, but you're talking about all this tape loop ideas, and it reminds me of this composer called Steve Reich. Mm-hmm. And he has a piece called Music for 18 Musicians that we'll put a link up to, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a piece of music written for 18 musicians. Mm-hmm. And it sounds very electronic, but it's all performed entirely live, and it's very loop-based, but not actually looped. So you get this impression that you're listening to a kind of experimental electronic person messing around with looping small little sections over and over, and the interplay of those different loops, but it's all performed live.
Continuously. It's like 60-minute piece or something like that.
And I can imagine actually being a very hard piece to perform for an ensemble because... it's very repetitive. You've got like a person singing a note going for 45 minutes straight, basically going up or down one note every now and then. It's a really fascinating piece. It's a really entrancing piece to listen to.
Yes, there's a good group who does, for his stuff for percussionists, So Percussion, we'll post a link to them as well. They're pretty amazing. They're a group of 4 percussionists. Sometimes they work with other percussionists and they do similar things. Yeah, they'll have super long phrases, like whatever they are, really long phrases where, they'll each be in a different time signature, and then every 27 bars they'll line up again.
Now I wonder, I have to look into this, but it sounds like sometimes his music was done like retroactively, as if he'd messed around with the computer and a sampler. And played 2 different timings against each other,
right? And
said, "Well, let's see if we can make human beings do this." He might be. I'd have to look him up. I forget exactly when his era was.
Who's the guy who does the metronomes? That's the lazy version of it.
John Cage.
Does he do the metronomes where he puts like 180 metronomes on stage and he starts them all at once and they then unalign and then they eventually align again? Is that him?
It could be him. I'm not sure. John Cage is one to. He has a piece also where
It's like 11 minutes of silence.
yeah, it's 4 minutes. The conductor or the performer walks out, places a piece of sheet music, and then stands there for like 4 minutes. I think it's called 4 minutes 33 seconds, something like that.
Yeah.
And it seems silly, but if you put it in the context of when that did come out, it was he was just trying to push the boundaries of where things are at.
Or he was like us. We were like, how do we get content? Oh, let's do a podcast. And he took it to the next step, which is just, I'll just do nothing.
It's Giorgi Ligeti.
Who does the metronome thing?
Yeah, Poema Sinfonico is for 100 metronomes. There's a video on YouTube. We'll post it. You can watch that piece.
And you can listen to your life go by.
I feel like the act of tweeting has sort of eliminated the need for all these experimental, pieces of art, because if they're exercises in futility or sort of acknowledging the arbitrariness of most art, then Twitter just kind of removes that impulse, because it's that what you're doing is so meaningless.
That's why Twitter should be funded
by the CIA.
Yeah.
There's an amazing movie called Untitled.
Oh,
while
yes.
we're talking about like experimental music and that sort of thing.
Well, that's at the end piece of that movie is so percussion. They perform that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So go check out this movie called Untitled. It's got Adam Goldberg in it. It is hilarious, but if you are the Arty-farty like jazz school, music school nerd, you're probably going to be incredibly offended by it because it's so spot on in making fun of artists.
I'm sure they would love it. I'm sure that
No, I've played it. I've told people about it in that world.
Yeah.
In fact, even Johnny Marlowe, because he's a photographer, he was like, "Oh, this is a little close to home."
It's so accurate, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clearly somebody from that world made that movie because it's so accurate.
Well, that just to finish on that music, the Steve Reich or the other piece that's at the end of that movie. I think one of the reasons it's so entrancing is that when you have human beings creating this kind of music that is repetitive and requires almost a trance state to perform it, that state that the performer enters of just repeating the same phrase over and over again, it becomes sort of like a mantra or a trance. And that I think comes across in the recording, where it has a sort of sympathetic effect on the listener where you enter that state as well.
We can't end it now because I think that kind of brings up an interesting point, because Steve Reich is a 20th century composer. Can you just, Dylan? Dylan has become our official researcher. Just find out when he is so I can not sound like an idiot. But it's funny that 20th century Western music has kind of come around to this trance idea of these repetitive things. And if you go listen to like ancient music from Central Africa, it's been preserved probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Pygmy music particularly has all this the exact same feeling to it of just almost mechanical, but human mechanical. It's really interesting stuff.
1960s, same era as Monty Young, Terry Riley, Philip Glass. He's like the good version of Philip Glass.
Ooh, diss.
Ooh, yeah, that's your
say that
name's fighting words.
Say that 100 times in a row, and you've got a Philip Glass piece.
Yeah.
You
have to say it backwards
there's,
a second
there's
time.
one, to give you an idea of that movie Untitled, there's one line which kind of sums it up, which is just perfect. And some guy's on a rant, and he says that harmony was a conspiracy.
A capitalist
conspiracy invented to sell pianos, which is one of the funniest lines in the movie.
All right, moving on to the music business. A long time ago, our dad had this tape, a quarter-inch tape, which is a big reel of tape, if you can imagine it, and he played it for us, and it was a bootlegged recording of the Troggs, who are a famous band that you'll probably know the song Wild Thing.
Wild Thing.
They wrote the original, and then Hendrix did it.
Yeah, so they're the original version of that. And our dad had a copy of this tape that's got to be one of the first viral things to ever occur, because it was in the 70s that he got this tape, and it went from studio to studio in London, basically engineers copying, tape to tape and parsing it around. And it's a recording of the Troggs in the studio trying to follow up Wild Thing. trying to come up with a song to follow up that hit, and an argument and the hilarity ensues.
Well,
Yeah, because they didn't know they were being recorded. The engineer left the tape running, and it's them basically under a huge amount of stress trying to follow this hit up, and they just can't get it right. And, you know, some of them are more skilled or intelligent than others, and it's really funny. Like had all these phrases that came out of it, you know, people basically mocking them.
what is a wobble board? That's one of the engineers in the studio, or the producer, says to the drummer, "What if we just put a wobble board on it?" And
Well, I think it was like an actual thing that made a wobbly
sound.
Yeah, it's a board. You just go, it's going to sound like that.
Huh.
So it was like the original.
It's just a wobble board.
The original memes in the studio world, because our dad tells us stories like everyone would just have these things like, why don't we just put a 12 string on it? Like that became a thing that every engineer and everyone having a difficult time in the studio would just say, quote lines from this tape.
It's kind of like turn the snare up. Like you know.
Sprinkle some fucking fairy dust on it. I think, you know, what it encapsulated was this frustration. You know, we've all felt it in the studio where you just can't get something to work. You know there's something there. You know the song's got something, and no matter what you try, it's just not capturing. And it's like a desperate thing, like, well, let's just try this, you know? And or like the producer's trying to... When the producer doesn't have the language to communicate with a musician, and he's trying to tell the drummer, you know, split your hands so that one's playing that one tom-tom and the other one's playing on the other tom-tom. It's like that's why we don't have a producer, is because I know there are good producers in this world, but it has to be the right language. And there's already 4 of us who are, you know how to speak to each other. And now you try adding another person trying to communicate music to us in a language that we may or may not understand, or they may or may not understand. It's like, it's just too many cooks.
It's crazy how viral it actually went, because even though our dad, I think, was one of the first to get that tape, it meant that everyone who had a studio basically had to make copies of these tapes. So all the studios in England and Europe started getting these copies of the Troggs tapes, and they were kind of like the running joke, but it wasn't just that they were making fun of them, it's that everyone could relate to it.
Yeah, and there's probably a foreign concept for people to, you know, a leaked tape now is just like, oh, what's the leaked tape of the day? You're expecting
marketing
to see
strategy.
Faked it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's on YouTube. We'll post a link.
Oh, yeah. Well. So, speaking of faked, leaked tapes, I asked if anyone watched the Super Bowl, the little kid that is in the selfie with Justin Timberlake. I said...
What is it?
Okay, so...
I mean, I know what the Super Bowl is, but
obviously Justin Timberlake was the halftime performance, and he runs up into the crowd, and he's singing, and there's this kid who appears to be trying to get a selfie or look up on his phone and see what's going on. He seems kind of out of it, and then he ends up taking a selfie with Justin Timberlake. And when I saw this, my immediate thought was, what is this an ad for? Because like before it even had chance to grow, it was trending on Twitter as, this is the biggest meme of the Super Bowl ever. And it just seems so manufactured. So I came in and said that, like, what's this an ad for? And Jesse goes, well, I think it's an ad for Justin Timberlake. Because, you know, it's hard to figure out.
He kind of looks like a young Justin Timberlake. I mean, what you have to realize is that almost nothing on social media that gets to the trending or, you know, gets widely spread is accidental. It's all paid for. It's all marketing.
It's all contrived.
Yeah,
I'd need to see what this even is to
It's not even worth seeing. It's just interesting that it seemed like it was... I mean, before it had a chance to actually trend. You know, it takes a little moment for something to spark and become the number one thing. It was like NBC or whoever the Super Bowl was on had set this up, or Justin Timberlake had set this up, because now 1 billion people are going to see this, you know, innocuous selfie that's not actually selling anything except for it's selling the new Justin Timberlake album.
Good on Justin Timberlake's marketing team. They're manipulating that stuff really well.
Is he just trying to be a total fucking dick though? Because have you seen what Prince said about virtual duets? He was like entirely opposed to them. He said, never do this with me, never use my image. This is why I want complete creative control. He thought they were demonic. He was like, because he's a Jehovah's Witness or whatnot. And so now, like, that's known. Prince is entirely opposed to duets, and then they go and do it.
Who did it? I didn't even watch the
Justin
Super Bowl.
Timberlake. They did a thing with Prince.
Well,
like,
it was talking about a hologram.
Oh,
and
it was a
apparently
hologram.
Prince had said
he's not
categorically
yeah.
he didn't want to do it. I believe even Sheila E., his drummer, right? From what are they called? The
Revolution?
Yeah, the new Revolution. Or Power. Yeah. Shit, I can't remember
Prince
the name
and
of
the
this.
Revolution.
Prince and
Yeah.
the Revolution, yeah.
Saying categorically he was opposed to ever doing like a duet with a hologram or being used in that way.
Yeah, he
But I
said
can't
if
remember
I
whether
was
they
meant
actually-
to play with Duke Ellington, I'd be in the same era. I'd have been born,
Yeah.
you know. So, like, that's just weird to me. Like, that there's an artist you supposedly respect and you admire, and then you just go fuck over his wishes.
I can't even remember whether they actually did that because I think that they were planning on it and then he might have.
No, there was a Prince
Back
part of the. Well, I
down.
didn't actually see it.
Is this all, we should have a fact checker because
It seems like
I didn't
just
watch
a
the Super
dick
Bowl.
move,
Did you-
though.
Who watched the Super Bowl?
I watched.
didn't-
Well,
I
went to a Super Bowl party and we ate snacks and had some beers.
I went to
He
the
backed
village,
out of using Prince hologram at the last minute.
but there was a Prince playback section or something like that.
I didn't watch it, so I
Yeah,
don't know.
okay. So it wasn't a hologram, but they definitely were projecting massive images of Prince singing.
I don't think Prince liked him. I think this was like some sort of like pissing on his grave type thing. It was weird.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll say this, that it does bug me when you see sometimes an artist's old recordings that a record label decides we're going to remaster, remix, do all these with. And they obviously have the rights to do that because that's what a record contract does. But it is sometimes really annoying when you know what it's like if they found your old demos and like, hey, check out this new song from KONGOS. And you're going, I didn't put that out for a reason because it's
Right.
not ready.
I was at the. I didn't see. I only saw part of it. I was at the Village Idiot at a British pub, and they were all watching the Super Bowl. That was funny, but I only saw a bit of the game, and then the part where the richest man in the world acted in a commercial. Jeff Bezos was in his own fucking commercial. It was on mute, so whatever he did, he acted badly on mute. And then there was a Nirvana song being used in some commercial with a little piano version of it. It was just everything about it was depressing. The entire world is an ad now. It's
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we say that from like our song is
Brought to you by KONGOS.
hey, listen. This I'm happy with hypocrisy if it pays us.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of controversy about the Nirvana thing. People.
Oh, so
but
that did touch a nerve. I think people are doing this now as intentionally. I think if you're an advertising agency, like the ad has got limited impact. Nobody can take in, their brains are already stuffed with nonsense. So how do you get them to take in something for 30 seconds? Well, you get them to talk about it afterwards. So you intentionally push, insignificant buttons and then get people to talk about it afterwards. So it's all manufactured.
To clarify the Prince thing, they didn't use a hologram, but they did use a big video wall, basically, or projection screen where he was singing along, and people are still upset about it. In the 1998 interview with Guitar World magazine, Prince was asked directly about using of digital editing to, quote, create a situation where you could jam with any artist from the past. He was not a fan. He said, "That's the most demonic thing imaginable. Everything is as it is, and it should be. If I was meant to jam with Duke Ellington, we would have lived in the same age. That whole virtual reality thing, it's really demonic. I am not a demon. Also, what they did with that Beatles song, Free as a Bird, manipulating John Lennon's voice to have him singing across the grave, that'll never happen to me. To prevent that kind of thing from happening is another reason why I want artistic control."
Yeah.
That's unequivocal. So Justin Timberlake, you're just why couldn't you just skip the Prince part? You're just a bad Prince.
I think, well, the reason they went for it is because Prince is from Minneapolis. The Super Bowl was in Minneapolis.
Who cares? It's Prince. Respect his wishes. Like, who fucking cares?
Yeah, well, that's been at the heart of it because he's had a big dispute. His estate has been a massive dispute about that very issue.
That is just, everything about people who manage estates, they just annoy me.
What else grinds your gears, Dan?
It's pretty remarkable that people just, like, how does it not strike you that you're a guy who supposedly admires this guy? you know he
Get no respect. These people, they get no
it's
respect.
weird. It is weird. It's just like I like everything about him except the part where he said I couldn't duet with him after he died.
At our next concert, we're going to do a duet with Justin Timberlake.
If Paul McCartney specifically asked us to stop doing Beatles covers, we would stop. Don't hold me to that.
All right. Let's move on to member berries. This is a specific member berry I have, and it's kind of vague because I must have been 5 or 6 years old when it happened, so it's like that kind of cloudy memory. But I went for a walk with my mom around our little neighborhood in London, and I got bitten by a dog. It was like a little white
How old were you?
Maltese Falcon. 5. I mean, we were living in London still, so I was younger than 7, but I'm guessing 5 or 6. I could walk then. Got bitten by this dog, so I have this, like kind of weird, just traumatic memories you don't have a real recollection of. And then I remember going home and crying and going to cry to my dad, and Def Leppard was sitting in the lounge with him because they, for those of you that don't know, our dad worked on the Def Leppard record Pyromania and did all of the drum programming on a Fairlight computer with Robert Mutt Lange, who was their producer and an old friend of our dad's because he was South African also. So our dad worked on that album for a long, long time because Mutt Lange was a legendary, spend a lot of time in the studio type of guy. So they were over there having some preliminary meeting or something or other, or discussing the album, and I come in crying about a dog that just bit me, and there's Def Leppard. Of course, at the time, I didn't know it was Def Leppard. But
it is kind of, it's a funny introduction to that because I must have met them too, but I think I was too young to really remember it. Yeah. But then fast forward like 20-something years. In 2006, they did a tribute album where they covered all the songs of their kind of heroes. And one of those songs was our dad's song, He's Gonna Step on You Again. They did a version of it. So they came through Phoenix and were playing the arena there, or the amphitheater there. And we went to see them, and they were kind of cool about it and had us backstage and chatted to us and caught up with our dad and everything like that. And I don't think we asked them about the dog biting memory. I'm sure they don't remember it, but it was a full circle.
that's what that song Pour Some Sugar on Me is about. It's an ancient remedy for dog bites. So let's move on, because actually we're going to keep this podcast relatively quick because we're doing another one after this for next week. So our
special guest.
Yeah, so our favorite piece of gear for the week, since we've been talking about bus call and filming and all that, is I'll let Danny tell you about this.
Okay, it's the Pixie recorder, Pix-E, and it's a thing you plug into your digital SLR. You take the HDMI out and you can record, higher quality footage, and more importantly, you can record multiple channels of audio. Because when we were trying to do this bus call stuff on a budget, usually when you're trying to get 4 or 6 channels of audio, there's an audio guy, with radios and stuff like that, and he's recording audio separately, and then you got to go sync up that audio with your video, and that's an entire mission. So this little device allowed us to record multiple channels of audio and saved us a bunch of time.
So the camera, we use these Sony cameras that are pretty high quality, but they're capable of more than you can do with them just built in. So our camera guys had this sort of apparatus where it's like a cage, a frame that you put the camera on, and then you can attach all kinds of accessories, including this recorder. You can attach extra batteries, you can attach microphones and lights and stuff like that, and it makes it look like a much fancier camera.
It's a great piece of gear. It's also a tiny bit of a curse, because you go from having a very small bodied Sony that you can kind of walk into anywhere and film with and not draw too much attention to, eventually looking like you've got a full-on rig. So immediately everyone starts looking like, oh, this is a actual production, and it makes it a little more difficult to just kind of be a fly on the wall. So section 6, what's it like being in a band with your brothers?
We should remove this section
good,
because it's
bad.
hard. Yeah, it's hard to come up with stuff.
There's only so much you can say. Like, we've got this question so many times. We've run out of all the pat answers. It's a democracy of 4 dictators. We say that every single time. And so until we come up with more one-liners, we're just going to gloss over this section.
I'll tell you what it's like. It's like going into machine mode in interviews when people start asking those questions. I fall into a deep sleep and I just start like repeating the same answers that I've asked or that have been asked of me in every other interview.
It's like that video of Bill Clinton in the 90s when somebody kept the camera rolling in an interview and they were doing his makeup. And so it wasn't supposed to be aired or anything, but they recorded it. And he literally looks like a machine powers down. His eyes glaze over. He doesn't move at all. It's really kind of weird. That's what it feels like when we get asked, what's it like being in a band with your brothers?
Well, when you see those press junkets that movie people do, that's they've got it the worst. And they just get delirious by the end of the day because they've done so many interviews.
Yeah, whenever they do a compilation of politicians or celebrities fucking up in an interview, I always feel a bit more sympathy for them when we've done, a small version of that, and you realize how tiring and how hard it is actually to keep it together just to answer the same question 150 times.
I'm surprised they don't. It's not worse.
Yeah, no,
the video we were watching it wasn't just like making fun of them. It was saying that they're all Illuminati puppets, and that they can't answer sometimes when they malfunction. That's what we're seeing, and it was just the most ridiculous conspiracy video because it was really funny, but obviously these people have never seen what a press junket looks like.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
MK Ultra. Yeah, they were saying they were MK Ultra candidates or something like that.
It's like, no, they've just been on the road for a week straight doing 24 hours of press.
Yeah, it's until you've done that, you can't quite understand, particularly like what a political campaign goes through. It's insane.
But also until you've been part of the MK Ultra program, you can't understand.
All right, so we'll finish up with our deep thoughts, and we said we're going to talk about hallucinations, but not the kind you're probably thinking of.
We had a common experience that I didn't realize. You said when you were a kid, well, you tell it, you got pneumonia when you were...
Yeah, we were traveling in South Africa, just a family vacation. I was a kid, and I got pneumonia on the trip. It's like bad enough that we had to cancel the vacation and drive home and get me to care. And I remembered I was hallucinating the whole trip back to Johannesburg from wherever we were, somewhere near Durban. And then later in the week, when I was recovering, I was sleeping in bed and having these weird hallucinations where I had a incredibly weird sensation of my hands being giant. They were resting on my stomach or on my side, and they were disproportionately huge.
I mean, it was a physical sensation hallucination.
I didn't see them, but I felt them as being massive. Like if you've ever seen that movie, The Science of Sleep, where he's running around with the giant hands, it truly felt that way. And so anyway, that's always been a vivid memory of mine. And I was 11 or 12 or something. And then you were saying you've had a...
Yeah, I got... when we were in Greece in 2009, I got bitten by something. I don't know if it was related to that. I got bitten by some sort of spider on my arm. Or it could have been heat stroke, or I was messing around with fasting at the time. Maybe I hadn't eaten in 36 hours or something like that. And I don't know what led to it. It could be a combination of all silly things. But it wasn't drug-induced or anything like that. But it was exactly that. It was a physical sensation of my arms and hands being sometimes miles long, and then they would come back and so on.
Well, I have read a study where they analyzed the brain activity of people entering into trance-like or religious states of deep prayer, and then being able to observe that from the outside, at least, certain parts of your brain that deal with space-time perception, like there's a temporal lobe, right, that deals with spatial perception, receives less blood during these states. So that, obviously from an objective standpoint gives a fairly good explanation of why you would perceive the size of your own body completely differently if you're messing with that part of the brain.
Well, there's a really interesting TED Talk with a guy named, what was his name? Anil Seth. And his premise is basically that our brain is constantly trying to make sense of our perceptions, which are all hallucinations, and that when what we call reality is just when enough people agree on the same hallucination. And it's all about how the incoming impressions and incoming stimulus is just made to make sense and arranged in a certain way based on your past experiences and your previous experiences, so that your things aren't constantly frightening you, basically, and constantly giving you something to work out and formulate in your brain.
You mean does it relate to object permanence, or the stages of development? Because the idea of language depends on object permanence. This idea that things don't change. So because you're not going to name something if it changes.
Right,
So,
and that's not actually what reality is.
yeah, reality is probably amorphous, or it's this continuous connected thing, but we have to separate it into
like
little bits.
every experience, every perception is constantly changing, and it's never the same as it was. But we categorize things kind of automatically, and our brain categorize things if they're somewhat similar, so that when you see something that, even though it's not the same, you've categorized it, and this automatic process where you've just put it into this box. And he does some pretty amazing things on this TED Talk, where he'll play a piece of audio to you, and it sounds like alien gibberish, where you can't understand exactly anything what he's saying, and then he'll play you the unfiltered version of that audio, which is someone saying something in English, and he'll play back the alien filter to you, and it's perfectly audible.
Right.
And he does a bunch of other these things to prove to you that it's based on your past perception of something, and once you've categorized it, once you've made sense of it, that now this completely new experience, you can use that to kind
So
of
as it relates to
correlate
this physical sensation, it definitely that's the way I kind of interpreted it at the time, because I was totally fine otherwise. I was I wasn't out of my mind. I was just having these physical sensations, and I was kind of commenting on them to myself, like, oh, my sense of scale has been messed up, because your sense of scale is habitual. Your sense of how big anything feels or how far anything is habitual, just like everything else. So if that habit gets interrupted.
Well, the idea of what you're saying also seems to relate to when you said that it's what we all agree on. If enough people agree on this idea, it's if you imagine each human being as a cell in a neural net parsing raw data, and then there's an agreement between this network that says, okay, well, this type of data we will now classify as that. And that's obviously occurring at a micro level within our own brains, but then it's occurring at a macro level across maybe all human brains or all brains. So yeah, that's really fascinating to hear that described in that way, like the idea of reality being related to subjective agreement. Ding.
Yeah, he literally describes it almost in those words. He basically says that your brain hallucinates your conscious reality, and billions of neurons in your brain are working together to generate this conscious experience and this agreed upon hallucination.
Well, I think everyone can probably relate to that experience at least somewhat. I mean, maybe I've not had it quite as extreme, but we've all had that feeling of like, am I really, is this how short I am, or is this how tall I am, or is this what the speed of walking feels like? Because there have been times where maybe sometimes it's related to a certain type of tiredness or a certain type of energy, like, you have too much coffee or something that basically jogs you into a slightly different state of consciousness, and your perception of space or time is just a bit off. So I've had times where I'm walking around and it feels like I'm walking in slow motion, like I'm this giant, and you imagine an elephant walking, or in a movie when they sort of recreate an image of a giant walking, it's like much slower.
Right. Well, your frame rate maybe. Yeah. I mean, when on tour, when we've done these promo runs, and you just do fly gigs, that's probably some of the tiredest I've been. And I can see my eyeball shake. You know how your eyeball vibrates? You get so tired that you can see it happening. It slows down to the point where your eyeball is vibrating, and it's just vibrating too slow.
Yeah. The funny thing to think about then is, if this reality is based on kind of consensus, even within your own brain, it brings up this whole kind of blockchain type idea of
consensus ledger,
like of what who is determining what's true and false it's done by consensus.
Mm-hmm.
But that implies then that there's some law governing the consensus. It gets very complicated, but it's interesting.
Eventually, it gets into the idea of duality and unity. That have you ever seen those magic pictures? I think what they were called. They were kind of like pixelated pictures where you can adjust your eyes and either squint your eyes or cross your eyes, and an image, a 3D image, pops out of it, and it can either pop out towards you or pop in towards you, or sometimes you'll be seeing a spiral moving in one way in motion, and based on whether it's automatic or intentional, based on your perception of that, it could be doing it one way or the other way, and it's neither. It's actually both. They're both happening simultaneously, and that both are kind of reality, both are true. It's that your perception that you've now directed your attention to, or not directed your attention to, doesn't exist for you.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, this does relate to it's the fact that it can be one or two things and you're choosing one side of it, right? Because if you like just simply draw an orthographic square, I think that's a good example. Or it doesn't even have to be orthographic.
What's an orthographic square?
Orthographic is when there's no sense of perspective. So you like if you use a really long lens, it will compress the depth data, and you'll get effectively something orthographic. Where, for example, if you look at something very close up, you'll see the vanishing point, right? An orthographic version of a square or of any object has no vanishing point. It's just two-dimensional. But those are very easy to wrongly interpret, to flip, or not wrongly interpret, to interpret in any way, that they're going in one direction or another.
Yeah, so based on habit, maybe, then you're going to perceive the world and every situation in one way, when maybe with a different directed attention or directed consciousness, you can alter your perception and perceive it another way.
And if this is happening at such a fundamental level, a rudimentary level of differences within your own brain of how to perceive a square, or the depth, the 3D depth of something, multiply that times 1 billion, and then try and have any feeling about what reality is in relation to like politics or music. It's kind of an absurd idea.
It's the binary nature of things. Jesse and I were talking about this, and this was a drug-induced problem, which is that when you smoke marijuana, you don't trust yourself, and that's what I reached the conclusion that at least low-level OCD seems to be a distrust of yourself, because I couldn't remember if I put the stove on or turned it off. So I kept going back and I checked it 3 times to check on or off, because the stove can either be on or it can be off. There's no in between. And you're picking a side. And because I had zero trust in myself, because my short-term memory had been short-circuited, I was unable to decide between which side of the coin it had fallen, and so you just keep fucking going back to the stove, checking to see that it's off.
Well, yeah, you have irrational or emotional fear interfering with what could be described as objective reality. Like the stove was off, or perhaps, but something in you was telling you. But
the problem was trust in yourself.
Yeah, I think that happens. That's definitely amplified when you're high. Yeah. But it's even the case when you're not high and you're in a kind of mechanical state. I've noticed when I'm trying to rush to do something and close up the house, for example, if we're going out or if we're going on tour, if I'm in a rushed state where I'm doing everything just very quickly and automatically, I'll get to the end of that process and get into the car and go, fuck, did I lock this? Did I do that? Did I do that? Whereas if I just calm down a tiny bit and I go up to the door and I go, I'm locking the door, or I'm turning off the stove, or I am here. And then, you get to the end of the process and you are sure of yourself. You have much more confidence in the fact that event happened.
Right.
Because if you're not there, you don't know.
So what you're suggesting
is it the binary thing adding confusion, though? Because the door can be locked or unlocked. So those are the 2 states that it exists in. So you have to pick one, right? Whereas you're not going to confuse things which are on a gradation. It's like, did I undercook the omelet? Did I cook it properly, or did I overcook it? You're going to remember how you cook the omelet because it doesn't exist in 2 states. Or maybe I'm just arbitrarily defining. It seems like binary things cause confusion in your memory. That's my takeaway.
my response, takeaway omelet. My response to that was that ultimately everything could be considered binary, because if you're talking about an omelet, you're really trying to determine, is it right or is it wrong? Because there's only one right way to cook an omelet. Everything, if it's undercooked or overcooked.
And if you want the right way, follow Curry Eggs and Toast on Instagram.
You know, this is very. I'm glad this has come full circle, because I got a non-stick pan for that purpose. You know, I usually don't cook with non-stick pans because who knows if they kill canaries or whatever. But I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take not having something to cook a proper omelet in, so I got one.
Okay, well,
FYI.
good.
Well, let's end with a proverb in relation to Dylan trying to get ready to leave the house. Less haste, more speed. I think that's what the approach we're going to take with rolling out our album in Bus Call. Less haste, more speed. We're going to be rolling it out slowly, so be patient, but we will be feeding you guys new stuff every week, and we're very excited about it. So check us out on kongos.com/podcast. On Twitter and Facebook and all those evil things, we're there too. So talk to you guys next week with a special guest.